call the meeting to order. We starting out with our long-term facility plan.
So at the last meeting, the whole meeting, we talked a little bit about, ideas around facilities and the idea to do a request for proposal for a long-term plan that included not only, physical kind of maintenance and upkeep and all of that, but looking long-term at classroom environments, science, chemistry type needs, as well as possibly some community integrated type needs. We talked about different options that people had looked at with, technical education areas, with, kind of a community center. So this was put together, it would actually be approved at the September meeting. I just wanted board members to have a chance to kind of weigh in. And so there isn't, the piece that you'll see that's open is like the deadline, because depending on when it's approved. For example, if we approved it on September 13th, I would guess like October 29th or so would be a deadline. So what this is just to get a facility, like a 25-year facilities master plan for the District of Cadott. It's not actually, then the board, as they go forward, would prioritize and implement things from the plan, but it's to get that plan coordinated. So, I don't know if people have questions, but it's somewhat specific as to the things that we would want. I mean, it also would look at traffic flow, it also would look at, back when we talked a lot more about school safety grants in this building, for example, people can come into the building without necessarily coming into an office. And in most districts, that's something that you would wanna upgrade. And then the timeline we would look at, but it would sort of help prioritize between some of those ideas.
So this one kind of kicks off what we talked about with, we find our gaps and then we propose what we.
Yes, so this would be an architectural firm that, and I mean, part of what they would do would be interview staff, interview people, you know, to say what kinds of things are we needing. You know, and I think even to be safe at the elementary sometimes, because it was redone not that long ago, we think like it's good to go, but we still wanna consider it, like, again, for future planning, what are things we need to pay attention to.
So Jenny, who does this go out to?
So, I mean, it would be posted in like the paper, but we would send it to specific architectural firms that we know of, like a Martin and Jackson and a Brady and a, you know, all of those that we've done, Carl Sanderson, we've done some work with in the past. And then they can choose to submit a proposal or not.
So they have their consultants that
Yes.
specifically address these types of things?
Yeah, so what they do is they give us a product that'll kind of say, you know, for this building, what do they see? Like I said, I mean, it's not quite the same as, for example, what CISA attended, just because they'll interview people, it'll look at traffic flow, it'll look at also that kind of point from an engineering standpoint, as well as just like boilers and the kind of bigger maintenance items like that.
So do you,
Go with your neck.
so do you suspect we'll have multiple plans come back?
So this is a request for proposal, so what they'll do is they'll say, we will complete all of this for, I don't know, I'll say $5,000, I mean, I don't, you know, and then somebody else will say, we'll complete it for $8,000. And then in there it says, we don't necessarily have to pick the lowest bidder, we can look at how they describe it and the pluses and minuses, we can do reference checks. But then we would choose, so this isn't actually the project, this is to bid to do the project, if that makes sense. It's like step 1A. But otherwise, if you have things that come up or questions, otherwise we would bring this to the September meeting.
Besides the gaps, so a couple meetings ago, we talked about potential of like field house community center, does that go into this on top of what they're doing?
It would be, like, we would say that's something we want you to consider.
Okay.
So part of it is then, like, once you choose your architectural firm, then we would say, like, they might be ideas they have that we haven't thought of, but we would then share all the things we've talked about, saying we want your opinions on these things.
Okay.
Any other questions on that? Alright, grading manual, I think it was at the July meeting, I didn't honestly look to, one of the things we had talked about was, not doing a whole redo just because of the timing, but to give some staff a chance to kind of give some feedback into the grading manual. If you look, it's very similar, you know, one of these, you'll see like Caleb updated quarter classes for 7th and 8th grade, because they're quarter, not trimester, so some are more logistical. It'll have like a little, you know, the addition here of, in final exams for 7th through 12, teachers may give a last unit summative prior to a final or accumulating project. Some of this is trying to overcome any communication issues that we might have had last year, to make sure that teachers understand and parents understand that we all kind of look at things the same way. And these are just some additions around Skyward, how do you enter a missing assignment? That Google, we have something, so Google Classroom and Skyward kind of talk to each other, but so that, kind of give it, again, this is to kind of deal with some other issues we have. So if a parent goes on Google Classroom, it shouldn't look completely different than if they go on Skyward to check grades, that they should be consistent. So those are some additions that way. And then, the biggest piece is the grade monitoring. You know, it doesn't mean we aren't doing grade monitoring, but I will say one of the pieces that we found last year was both through the principal office, like the most effective grade monitoring connections were from teachers to parents. That, you know, when I would have a list of parents that I would contact, no one said, oh, I had no idea. In fact, if anything, some people were, I won't say unhappy, but they were like, yes, the counselor called, the teacher called, the principal, you know, I will say all of the families that I had talked to had a lot of other issues going on and didn't necessarily appreciate my call the same way. So again, it doesn't mean we're not monitoring grades, but that responsibility would fall, again, primarily to the teachers with the building principals doing that monitoring. So this, again, this would be at approval in September, but we wanted to share the changes that we've talked about now. And I think as we go forward, you know, there'll be bigger term discussions around, you know, are we gonna look at standards-based grading and some of those things, but we just felt like this was not the year to do a big dramatic change.
Will principals be contacting home after a certain time? Or
If-
just as teachers?
I mean, it'll be kind of with the principal and the teacher. So I mean, I would say if there's an issue where a teacher's not communicating,
Yep.
that's a different kind of issue than versus the grading issue.
So once a student falls below 70% and or above below their ability,
Mm-hmm.
then the teacher will be contacting home.
Correct, but it's not listed in here the same way. Let me look at
It
mine.
is listed on here that will happen, it's just not as laid out as the bottom of that sheet had like after 2 weeks I'll contact, 2
Yes.
weeks teacher contact, that part's out.
This is
so
still there.
The other part's still there. And one thing I noticed is that I had staff all year calling, so what I found beneficial was for me to more track the grades using a math spreadsheet, which I'll continue to do. And that was more beneficial to me to communicate with teachers of, you know, why are you having so many lower grades in your classroom, what's going on, versus are you calling home on all of these Fs. So I think naturally by seeing how many Ds and Fs I'm having per teacher that I'll track, I can get at that piece of, is there lack of communication because of this, you know?
Okay. And then the other question was if we scooted up to the part where we talked about cumulative tests and summative tests.
Mhm.
Teachers may give a unit summative prior to a final culminating project, is that what it is?
Yes.
Can you explain to me what that is? Is it any different than last year? Is it any different between Q2 and Q4?
I think well, semester one and semester, well, I see what you're saying. I think finals are typically like semester, so if somebody does a comprehensive final, like culminating, it could include everything from, like, in January, it could include everything from the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
And they might give a unit summative, like on the last unit prior to doing, so like students could have two big assessments kind of in a row. Like one is on what we just learned and one is on everything we learned.
Yep.
So that's the idea of that. Not everybody does that necessarily the same way. I don't know if you have other experiences with that, Caleb, but I think that's the idea of that, is just to help any confusion on, because of, between the retakes of summatives and the retakes of finals. Because that's where we had some confusion last year.
So this is where I think the confusing part for me is some classes may do a summative, some may do a cumulative, some may do both. Now, how do we know exactly? The only way we know is if the teacher puts that in a rubric right out of the gate. Or would it be easier just to know that every class we're gonna have a unit summative and then a final at the end of Q2 and Q4?
I think it says there are accumulating final exams or culminating projects that are required for any final grade marks for high school. So they have to give a cumulative.
So at the end of Q2 and Q4, we're gonna have a cumulative final.
If it's a semester class, I guess I should have said that. So for example, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something that, if, I'll use geometry. The cumulative usually then doesn't always go to, from September to May. It like cumulative usually means a semester of work, cause you, at high school, when you earn that credit for the semester, you kind of, that's sort of fair game. I think that's not quite the way I wanna say it, so that it'd be for that semester's credit. And I'm talking just about high school kids now, because
Yep,
that's how they
yep.
earn the credit. The credit's on your semester work.
Brad, are you just saying it's inconsistent if they have a summative test before the final? It's like
Well,
a summative test and today's
So,
the final?
I think that it would be very beneficial if Q2 and Q4 were the same, right? So Q2 is really the end of,
Yes.
I wanna make sure I'm not wrong. Q2 is really the end of us, like, semester, and then Q4.
Yes.
So at the end of Q2, if everybody's doing it the same, which I guess we are giving cumulative projects, right? Which then cumulative projects cannot be redone for makeup, that's,
Correct.
okay.
Because that was the piece, because,
And-
and they're like right at the
And
end.
if we're doing, and if a class is geometry 1 and geometry 2, as long as it's the same for Q2, Q4, but if Q2 is different than Q4, that's a little confusing too, so. Not, maybe teachers are doing that, but maybe, do we need to put something down where everybody knows that that's
Need to clarify
happening?
that.
And it's not just geometry, right? It's every class
Right.
doing something different in Q2 and Q4. I feel like they should be similar, I could be
So
completely
maybe
wrong.
it's
and
some
maybe-
clarification on finals for semester 1 and semester 2 for high school. Because we just called them cumulative finals, we didn't call them semester 1, semester 2.
And maybe it's just me not understanding, and just,
Well, but we want to communicate it clearly, that's kind of why we want the feedback, so if it's a little bit confusing, that's why we're
this is
here.
where, I don't wanna like force something on a teacher and then at the same time think, like I spoke to a teacher once and she was like, if you tell me exactly what you want, this is what we're doing, right? And then that was good also, right? Like,
Right.
So knowing exactly what is expected is kinda nice sometimes as well.
Yeah. No, I agree. Any other thoughts or feedback? COVID protocols, this was actually based on the last meeting. So I did remove, because I found that sentence to be confusing after we talked about it, as far as, I mean, the idea is, we recommended, but that's not what we were following. So at this time, again, masks will be optional for students and staff. this could change if there are changes. I did share with board members, Stanley developed kind of a tiered plan, where they look at the percentage of students who are out, either positive or quarantined, and then depending on that tier, I think at 13% or so, then they have masks required in certain situations, and then after 20%, they have kind of more restrictions on visitors and some other things. We don't have a tier plan like that in place at this time. That's something that we can talk about. Everything else is the same, other than the change that we have learned since our last meeting is, and I did send a note out to families around requiring masks on transportation. All other districts except us and Bloomer were doing that. We are the only two that were using Covisint. They had talked about that they didn't necessarily think the federal mandate applied to school buses, but since then, both our insurance carrier, the attorney for the insurance carrier, and Steve Well, the attorney that works with the district, have said you need to follow the mandate while it's in place. So I did change that piece, that's why it's highlighted, just because I added it. The other piece I'll say that you might get some comments, because we've got now at a point where we have some people who are positive or quarantined. The federal FMLA leave that allowed people to take time off without using any of their own time or penalty, that actually technically expired December 31st, and then we as a board, it was extended to June 30th. But that, it did expire at that time, and so at this time, right now, if someone has to be off, they can use sick leave, personal leave, emergency leave, any of those types of things, but there isn't kind of I guess I'll call it, it's not really free COVID leave, but it is, because it doesn't do any deduction for them. And so that's what's in place at this time. And I would say that's, as far as other districts within Triple County, that is consistent. Not everybody extended it to June like we did necessarily if we did, but no one has extended it after that.
Does WIA have mask mandate now?
They have some, and I guess I'll introduce quickly. So Erin Crank is our new athletic director, so welcome Erin, but if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, their only mask requirement is on transportation.
Just transportation, okay.
I think it would be helpful to have something like Stanley has, just for transparency and so that everyone in the district kind of has an idea of what's coming, and kind of like what we talked about at the end of the year last year, that if we have guidelines, then we don't want to take it aback when all of a sudden we say, oh, starting Monday, masks are going to be required, or, we're all of a sudden at whatever levels that we are. Hopefully that doesn't have to become an issue, but I just think it would be a good way to have transparency throughout the whole district, so no one is, everyone is prepared, everyone has the same information. If you're posting that information on our website, then people can go and look and see what our numbers are. Obviously, there's people still on both sides of the spectrum, and I just think if everyone is on the same page, knowing what our guidelines are, it will cause less frustration, hopefully.
And at least, like you said, people could know ahead, so I can work on that for the September meeting if that's something that board members think is helpful. The other thing that I did start, that I shared with parents today, is the kind of COVID dashboard. So every week, we just update with how many positive quarantine. And this will get linked to the website. And for all of them, I put a day at a time, because it does, I mean, sometimes within 10 minutes, something changes one way or the other. I have any to the change from the prior week, just because during the summer, we didn't get updates from public health on students, or staff, unless people notified us themselves, so going after this week, then we'll have that change comparison.
So as of now, these numbers are obviously staff numbers, because there's no students in school.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So, like, once I would say within the last like couple weeks, because sometimes people are quarantined into, after September first, we got some notices on students.
Okay, thank you.
So I will work on kind of a tiered plan that we can talk about in September. Is there any other feedback from board members? Building leadership team, so, one of the things, and I shared a few things. Elementary and secondary are a little bit different. One reason is our elementary school is a school-wide Title I school, so sometimes there are requirements that have to be met for them because of the federal dollars we get from that. So sometimes there is a little bit different. They have a reading specialist and Title I representation that just doesn't apply the same at the high school. But the idea is, in these building leadership teams have been in existence, I don't know, for a very long time, I guess I'll just say it that way. The idea is that you have representation from different groups. So at elementary, it's different grade levels. At the secondary level, it's different content areas. People kind of apply to a principal. This is just an example. On Monday, we worked with both groups together for a while, and then they had some time in the afternoon that they focused on their building work. I'm trying to think of any. Staff members who participate receive a stipend of, say around 15, I think 37 for the year. They do meet once a month outside of school time. Yeah, 1537.
I think 15 for 15 elementary, 15 high school.
I don't think they're exactly the same. The elementary, I believe, is bigger because they have the Title I representative that they have to have, reading specialist. So, I'm not exactly sure how many they have, but they aren't necessarily equal in each building.
And I think I saw on here, Terry, put something, actually, elementary school has something. Do we have something on how these candidates are chosen year after year? How, do they apply for this, or is it?
So it's a little bit different at the elementary, but at the secondary, they apply. Part of it is you have to kind of want to be involved in building leadership, and moving things forward. But yeah, so for example, if there's 2 math teachers that are interested, only one of them is going to be on there, for that time.
In junior high, senior high is 4 years, just like the elementary school. And do we have something that says this?
Not necessarily. So the secondary doesn't necessarily rotate the same way. Elementary does. That's in that document
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Terry rotated. Part of that is because of the title requirements.
Mhm.
Part of it is sort of that sweet spot of you don't want to have so much turnover that you're always trying to get people on board, but you want to also develop leadership in everybody. And I mean, if you look at the Monday piece, we're really trying to focus on how do we develop leadership in all kinds of people so that they feel somewhat empowered to do that. And I'll say, I mean, I think it's been a little bit more of a struggle at the secondary level because there's been more turnover. And so part of that is just trying to get some wheels under that to have some stability right now.
So I guess my only takeaway is looking at those, I think it'd be good to have the two line up a little bit on how they're chosen or terms. I mean, I think it'd be good for the teachers as well, just to say, this is what the expectations for this group are, right, in this 4-year term, or, I mean, maybe you could be elected longer, I'm not sure, but there's something out there that kind of lays that out. I think that would be good. As we talk later today, I might be bringing up another thing to throw into that building leadership group as a takeaway potentially, but, I've seen a lot of the notes that we passed along that you were sharing. I don't know if those could be shared on a Friday after your, like, Friday notes or something like after they happen, but you can make them available on the Friday notes at your kind of need just to see.
Oh,
They'd be informative, I think, for somebody like me to
I see what you're saying.
look at them and see what's
like,
try to understand.
like kind of the meeting notes.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's a takeaway of how we get that on the agenda, but a way for me to learn, I guess, what's going on.
Okay.
Was there other question? I think it was sort of answered, but I know that whatever it's talked about, I don't know if there's like goals or like there's an end game and all that. Let's just say this, grading policy, I don't know if that goes through that or.
I mean,
one
that
of
is,
goes through those.
like, that's one of the teams that gave
Yeah.
feedback on that, just because they're, that's part of their role, is kind of to represent people. And I would say, I mean, the other is their goal, once we get to that annual scorecard again,
Yep.
that's kind of their goal,
Okay.
especially the academic achievement and the student social emotional stuff. That's kind of their marching orders, and I mean,
So they don't need specific goals, they kind of tackle the district goals, is it?
right, like they'll set up then their own building goals, cause they'll look different in each
Okay.
building.
Okay.
And they might prioritize different things, different years. You know, I'll give you an example. In reading, we're doing a lot of work on literacy. At the secondary level, it's on vocabulary instruction across all areas. At the elementary level, it's on, kind of the new reading resources and comprehension and those kinds of things. So, like, it's not the same necessarily in both buildings, but that's part of what they determine, is they look at their data, and then they set some of their action steps for that.
Yeah, I guess if there's like a summary and like, and their notes, I think that'd be helpful for me as a board member to understand what's going on. I don't know, maybe nobody else, you know, somebody
Well, and I
else
don't,
can talk
like,
to.
when I think of our meeting in May, like, or May, on Monday, you know, there aren't necessarily minutes of those meetings, but, like, when you see the agenda, there's those kinds of things that, and, I mean, there could be, like, as we have takeaways that we share out when we think about communication, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Are you more asking, how do you know what the progress is?
I guess if there is progress and or what progress was made, at the same time, like, if we have big meetings at work, usually the person who facilitates it, if it's the CEO or the whatever, who's ever running it, if it's a really big group, it gets summarized and sent out to group managers or something, but I think it's for everybody to look back at what we talked about and at the same time remember and go learn from it. And I'm sure there's good stuff going on in all these meetings, and if we can learn from it and understand what's going on, I think that would be a good tool for us. Plus, then, I mean, we can see what's going on, so.
And a lot of it ends up to be even for them, because most of them are kind of connected to a professional learning community group. Then that's what, like, if I'm the second grade one, then when I go back to my second grade group, that's what I talk about and share kind of back and
Yeah.
forth as well.
Or maybe something pops up and we think, maybe that would be a great goal for the building leadership.
You know, and I will say, and I mean, we'll maybe talk about it a little bit at retreat, I mean, the idea is, because they're the closest to the problem, to have them own it as much as
Yeah.
possible, and kind of work on trying things with it. So, like, part is, we're not as directive with that group as I might be, like, with all staff on some of the other pieces that we do. Other thoughts?
I agree, I just think it's helpful to see what's discussed, and, you know, a lot of that stuff ties back to our strategic plan, so to see that there's, you know, those discussions that, I assume that there was, but it's nice to see how that's broken down at a teacher level, so, you know, I think it's interesting and helpful to see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next item is the vaping class action lawsuit. So because we are a client of Weld Riley, they are invited to be, and we are invited to be part of a class action lawsuit around student vaping. What this means, I can't say, I mean, I can share the document with you. There's information and data that we would share with them about student vaping and disciplines, issues that we have with that, students that miss school because they're suspended because of vaping, that type of thing. Then there really is, there's no cost to us at all. I mean, it is kind of like when you see the TV ad, you know, you don't get paid unless you win your case. It's hard to say what level of payout would be possible, but for us, I mean, I can say what schools are looking at is, educational pieces for students. Some schools are looking at the, vape detectors in the bathrooms and the restrooms and those kinds of things, which are very expensive that we probably wouldn't necessarily be able to get otherwise. So this, again, we would take action on in September, but because it's kind of lengthy, I wanted people to have time, or if you have questions that I need to come back on. I think Bloomer and Stanley are the other two districts that are part of this attorney group. They both have, agreed to be part of it. As far as local districts, I mean, obviously there's more than that.
One of the questions I had, so the attorneys that file this paperwork, we do have to pay for that, correct?
No, so what'll happen is whenever they win, whatever settlement they win, then they take a percentage of that. And so.
You get nothing, they get nothing.
Correct. So financially, there really isn't any risk other than doing the paperwork that they're asking if you didn't get anything. I mean, my guess is there would be some level of settlement. I really don't know how you would guess what that might be.
Yeah, class actions are typically opt-in because lawyers get the lion's share of it.
That's how we pay.
Yeah, we need the lion's share.
Do you feel like on these questions, Jenny, that they pertain to us, that we have?
I mean,
the-
yeah, we
the
would have
enrollment?
that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah,
So it'll take, I mean, that's, like I said, I suppose that the downside would be it would just take us some time to get that information to share. So part of it is, I'll see if I can find it, it's actually, I mean, so Weld is working with, I'm just trying to look at the kind of broader attorney group.
Carpet now.
Yes, that's not here. So it's all, it's under that kind of, that page. 12. And then you'll see under 2A, like our designation is Stephen Weld of Weld Riley, to kind of represent us within that group. But again, there isn't, that would all be part of the settlement, not anything that we pay up front. So. Any other questions? Okay, strategic plan review, and if you look in your hard copies, so one of the things that Drew had suggested is, the top one is the kind of 5-year plan. We did some updates after, we met with Drew, trying to have a little bit more family-friendly language. And then Drew suggested kind of like a 1 to 2 year plan, that's the second one. That could be a little bit more specific, because it's true, when you look out 5 years, sometimes even with your actions, they end up sounding a little bit generic. And so one thing I will say is, after I shared this, I talked to Drew Friday afternoon, and his one piece of feedback on the 2 year plan, so on some things, so I'll just give you an example. On the first page, goal 3, I sort of did a midpoint of the goal. So like goal 3 on the big plan is 76 to 85% of students. But on that 2 year plan, I said 76 to 80% of the students. Part of his feedback, and this plan will come in September for approval, is, for example, I didn't change the exceed expectations on the DPI report card, or the 100% of students completing an academic and career plan. And part of his feedback that I missed is then we're saying actually in 2 years we'll exceed expectations instead of in 5. And so, you know, there's not a midpoint category on that, but I could work on some language around, you know, increasing the EPI report card scores or something like that. It's a little bit tricky because we'll have a new baseline in November, but, so that's, one piece of feedback that I got after I shared this, that we'll look at. And the other piece that, we have looked at adding that Missy's worked on is just kind of a glossary of terms. So we've tried to make it more user-friendly, but adding that in so that if there is something that people are kind of stuck on, that there's a reference that they could go to for that. So given that feedback, plus any feedback I get tonight, what the timeline will look like is I would share these out with our original design team, kind of planning team. For any feedback they have, we'll repost it on the website. But then the plan is that the plan would be approved at the September board meeting.
Alright, question on goal 3, is that if we go and start surveying all the people who do outside activities, that's gonna significantly change our goal right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming we're gonna hit our goal in year 1. That's my assumption. I don't know if we wanna look at that after we do an initial survey.
I mean, we could, you know, because maybe that gives us a new baseline. I'm not sure. Part of it is, I'm not sure, I'm hoping we get good response rate on that, you
Yeah.
know, and one of the pieces that we found generally within the district is kids that are part of extracurriculars often will join and be part of more extracurriculars.
Yeah.
It's harder to get kids who aren't part of any extracurricular to be part of some extracurricular. So I think even sometimes kids who are in like Boy Scouts are also in baseball or, you know. So I don't know how many brand new kids it will bring in necessarily, and maybe that's something that we have to adjust a goal once we get that information.
When we say survey families, couldn't we just survey the kids? I mean, they know what they're in, right? I mean, we don't need to survey the families, you get 100% response rate then.
We can.
Even first graders know what they're in.
Yeah, I don't know, if we survey then, can we take what we had last year from our participation numbers? I don't know how we compare it though. It would almost be impossible to compare.
Yeah,
Right.
and I'm trying to understand too, like, is one the goal and the other one just a reference number saying, yes, you know, we have maybe 75% in school activities, but if you look at the other school activities, that raises it to this percentage. Maybe that is or isn't part of the goal, but I think it's really good information to have.
Mhm. Well, and I guess that's the other piece I wanted to be sure is, my assumption is we want that information differentiated, like, or disaggregated is the word I meant. You know, so that we don't just lump it together.
So C will be, but won't be part of potential of the 76 to 85.
I mean, I
You're
think
thinking?
it,
I think that's the question.
I guess,
That is the
I'm
question.
open, I mean, I'm open to feedback on that. I mean, the idea is, the original idea is kids who are connected to extracurriculars at school are more connected to
Yep,
school.
yep.
But we also know some students are involved in lots of other stuff, through 4-H or whatever else it might be, or their church youth group. They aren't gonna have time necessarily. Now, it's still, it gives them good connections, not necessarily a school connection. So maybe that's part of, you know, is that just information we have at this point?
I guess I thought that's what we kind of discussed in the last meeting, and that's why we lowered the goal percent from 85 to 80, so we can get an idea of what kids are doing outside of school. Is that something maybe we could bring into our school? Where's interest that we're missing? I thought it was more of an informative piece.
I think it's twofold. I think there's the latter part, which you said, which is, are we missing activities here that we should have? Like, if we find out that 30% of our kids are in this one activity, well, then why don't we do that, right? But I think the other thing is too, is understand what that attainable number is, right? So we set our number at 86%, and we find out that 30% of the kids are already in 5 nights a week activities outside the school. Well, clearly, you're never gonna get that other 30%, right? So the 86% is literally unattainable because these kids are active. And I think that's, I mean, I'm making that number up, of course. But I think that's the part we have to understand. I mean, I think about my daughter, right? She's 2 to 3 nights a week of outside activity, nothing to do with the school. So I mean, she's not gonna take another one, right? I mean, that's already plenty for her. And so that's kind of where I think that, for me, is the information I wanna know, because if we've set 85%, and then we find out later, like, oh, well, 20% of the kids are already very active outside of school, we'll never hit 85%.
Right,
And I guess that's why I wanna know that number.
right.
So it's kind of additional information, but not rolled into the goal.
Yeah, that was my understanding.
Like how to modify our goal. Sounds cool.
Other thoughts?
So this has, so I know this, you know, a lot of these updates are from when the school board meant to give feedback as well. Not all of, I think, the suggestions went into this, and I'm curious to know, it's hard for me, you know, to recollect, you know, what suggestions were made that did get in, and which ones were made that did get in. I don't know if there's an easy way to kind of know that.
I mean, when we did, some of the questions, I don't know that they necessarily became an action plan. I mean, it was sort of a question of, like, do all kids have a plan for the ECP plan and some of those? I just am looking to see, because, I mean, the idea was really that those would be incorporated.
I think the big one that sticks out to me is the staff engagement, goal number 1. I thought we had changed that to increasing the number of people that filled out the survey from changing the number of the scale. I thought that was one of the feedbacks we had talked about.
Are you talking about from the 1 to 5?
So staff
Are you talking about
engagement-
staff engagement?
Staff
goal two?
engagement,
Or
goal
goal?
number 1, right, which is, oh wait, where's the one that recommends the school number, which one is that, sorry?
That's goal 2,
Goal 2, yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, so that's the one I thought that we basically said, instead of trying to increase that number, we would try to increase just the number of surveys completed, or,
Okay.
because that was kind of like the bigger premise there. If we're not getting feedback, then clearly those people are the ones that we need to hear from anyway.
So maybe I know we talked about that, maybe I misunderstood that was kind of.
That's how I understood, maybe the board didn't understand that way either, I don't know.
The other piece though that I wanted to mention connected to that one, because we talked about like kind of the 4.02 to 4.6, because we talked about what's the scale of 1 to 5. And then I did add in, so I'm on that 3rd page, because some people said that was hard to understand. So then I took what percent either agreed or strongly agreed, that was 61.5, or were neutral, agree or strongly agree. The advantage, and not that, to having kind of the average of the 1 to 5 is, it sort of takes into account everybody. If I strongly disagree, all of that counts in the average. The other advantage to the average is there are norms for that, which I didn't think of that night at the meeting. But maybe if we're gonna not have that goal at all and just use survey participation, then it doesn't matter.
Do you remember offhand what the survey participation was, what we're missing, was it 5%, 10%?
It was, I will tell
11%,
you.
I thought 10, 11% stuck in my head too.
No, I mean, it was, our goal was 90%, I believe. Let me just tell you, so I'm not making it up. So the goal was to increase it from 89.5% to 95%, and we had 80%. That's how many staff participated.
So 20% didn't participate, how many people get that, like, how many staff members?
About 120.
Okay, so it's simple, 20, 25 people, yeah, that's a lot.
So what do other people think? Do you want to replace that with just go, survey participation?
I feel like until you get that number up, you don't really have an accurate survey. That's my biggest issue. Missing 5 or 10%, I mean, that's not great, but missing 20%, that's statistically not great.
more than just who's taking it. We wanna get something from it, so I feel like I'd rather have what's currently listed.
Can we add that goal?
Well, or do we
Yeah,
make,
Make it a two-part goal, or add.
or do we make
four.
goal two a, I guess, I don't know, it's not a measurement, and then it can't be an action. I feel one of them needs to be listed as an action or something, I don't know how to do it, but, yeah.
Well, and we could put an action item of increasing staff participation in the survey as a strategic action.
Yeah, I think that should be maybe an action on that.
Does that fit if we do it that way?
It might not fit, but it's gonna make sure we remember it.
Right.
Gives you more of a lift
And then we
into
work
the
towards that.
partner.
Yes.
At least we list that as a caveat when we're listing the data, that it's.
Right.
Well, I do feel like they're kind of connected, like, yes, we could also just do it as a goal forward, but they are kind of connected. Okay. Anything else that you noticed or that you were thinking got missed from when we met? Because again, I mean, I looked at the notes, but.
So I know we talked about it, and I don't know how it fits into the strategic actions for community engagement. I know we specifically did talk about posting on social media, and things of that nature. I know it's not specifically listed there. I know you're also working on that for the next meeting as well. I just didn't know if that fit, if that's too specific for an action, or if it's not, which one does it fit under, like, currently? Like, where would that social media posting fit?
So I think in, you know, maybe it is, it's, I'm just trying to look, you know, I feel like it's somewhat under the goal one. So one of the things, if you remember, I talked to Joe Donovan from the Donovan Group about a communication plan. And I talked to him a little bit on the phone. I'm gonna actually, either this Thursday or Friday, have a chance to connect with him to kind of talk through it. Because, so that's what they do, and so he has some specific recommendations around social media, but also around other things. So a lot of his, and part of it is, it might be a multiple year plan, because it will probably involve staffing to be able to, like, to update the website and have like a board page that's, you know, more active and some things like that. I mean, we might have to look at more support to get that accomplished. Part of his discussion on social media is kind of that you notice a meeting, but you link it to you wanna drive people to your webpage. Because what you don't want is a public forum that's outside of your board forum. And so he just said that's where you can kind of get into trouble, open meetings wise and everything else. But so you can do some things there that drive it, and then, I mean, I shared the strategic plan, so I think he had some other ideas even with other community events. But we talked a little bit about that specifically, so maybe part of it is developing a communication plan that, because again, even once we get that, we might not be able to do everything the first year right away, but then that'll be something we work towards, because even, as we talked about tonight, and this one I think I'll own and maybe be more responsible with is, you know, generally committee meetings are more kind of work meetings, and we've said kind of not action items unless we need them in a timely fashion, which kind of happens, but maybe, I mean, other districts just have monthly board meetings. You have to wait until the next monthly meeting, unless it's so urgent you have to have a special meeting. And maybe we can talk about, if I'm more strict to that, about these are informational meetings, because even with the live streaming, you know, that is, for example, originally when I thought about it, I thought of just regular meetings, because I thought of that with the public comment and everything else, but then I know, like, you sent something for this meeting, so do committee meetings and regular meetings, like, is everything live streamed? How do we determine what we do with that as well? And not, I don't know, like I said, I mean, just kind of, I think so that it's more organized. So I guess to get back to Corey's question, maybe that is an action under there, is the development of a communication plan that can include social media, but other things as well.
Right, I agree, it's more than just social media.
But then it can, and that way, like, everybody knows, because sometimes we talk about it, or Nick and I, like, but then if I forget or whatever, then it's, I just think it's more laid out in concrete. So I would add that. Other pieces?
We're gonna know our DPI report card in November.
Yes. That's what they say. And they're kind of changing the formula for that, so, I mean, it's sort of a new baseline, but, I mean, that's happened before, we still just sort of look at.
So our plan is to take that number in November, see what exceeds expectations, what that number is, and then in 5 years, we're gonna make that gap.
I think, right, and I think it'll still be, so right now, 73 is the score you need to exceed expectations. I'm guessing that will stay the same from the little bit that we've seen, but part of it is once we know, like, here's where we're at, and kind of pacing that out. And, I mean, obviously, so I won't have it in September for approval, but maybe I'll just word that short-term goal as making progress towards exceeding expectations or something like that. Because then once we do that, then we'll do that annual scorecard. We'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow night too, like, how do we take that now and get it to our working document that we kind of is, I guess in my head, kind of the beat of our work for the year.
One thing on that too, and again, I'm not suggesting we change at this point, I think we're too far down the road, but I know Brad, several times when we looked at that, I think it was always brought up when people come to this district, they look at this compared to other districts, and that's how they figure out if they're gonna come here. And I wondered if in retrospect, the goal should have been written for, have a better DPI report card than the neighboring districts, right? I mean, I know it's a hard thing to do, but if the goal is to be better so we attract more people, then the goal literally should be just have a better report card than neighboring districts. Then it doesn't matter if you're meeting or exceeding, it just means you're better, right? And so now it's much more relative. And I get that's a harder one to measure.
Yes.
Or maybe
Well,
harder
to track over, because they'll
It's-
move and we'll move.
I get that, but
But-
fundamentally, we know we gotta strive to be better, and then if we are better, then that's the end goal, right? I don't know if that's something we wanna entertain at this point, but I did think about that, I'm like, that's really what we're driving at though, right? Like, that's really what we're trying to get at.
Well, and I can share tomorrow, like I shared at the opening, I mean, there's some trends that we have between, and I just picked local, so I did us, Stanley, Augusta, Thorpe, and Cornell, to see what do the trends look like, so that, because ours are increasing and not all of theirs are. So yes, I mean, I think even if it's not changed here, that's something we could look at to track.
Yeah, it might
And
be
maybe that's
something to
part
help
of
to
what
get
it
us
is.
there, I agree.
Corey wants to be very stable. 5 years.
And that was all.
Other thoughts? Okay. All right. So, the football track and the end zone requests, I know board members had gotten some comments, that's part of why I asked Erin if she would come. She had reached out, there was kind of a group of football parents that had, several requests around opening up part of the playground, having some tailgate ahead of the games, different things. Most of those things were kind of okayed, or I guess I'll say kind of approved at our level. With the tailgating, we did ask them to coordinate with Keith Becker, just because FFA, that's their main fundraiser, and we wanted to make sure there weren't any hard feelings there, and I think that's been happening. But the two areas that we said no, and it was kind of a conservative approach, but, so I guess part of that is, once again, our next home game is September 17th. So if the board chooses, this could be added to the regular meeting agenda. Was around having fans that can be able to be on the track and kind of closer to the action and follow up and down. You know, really it was around, since the work was put in on the rubberized track, trying to kind of be conservative and protect that. Erin did reach out to neighboring districts, I can let her talk, I shared a little bit of what she gathered. Most, as far as we know at this time, not that there aren't some, districts that allow fans on the track have blacktop tracks, not, rubberized. But, I mean, there sure might be some. It's sort of just, I understand the argument, like the community bought the track and they paid for it, so they should get to be on it. But then there's also weighing that with how do we be responsible for longevity, so we don't have to go back to the community. So, I don't know if you wanna just talk a little bit, Erin, about some of the districts that you've talked to and your
Yeah.
thoughts, and then,
Can I pass this
Yep.
up? So we had an AD's meeting with the Cloverville Conference.
oh, they have it,
Okay,
yep, sorry.
fantastic.
Yeah, we just got it.
We had an AD's meeting with, Cloverville AD's in the beginning of August, and I also reached out to all of the Dunsink and Croydon football schools, because when they brought it up in their initial meeting to us, it was pointing out all of the schools that do it, and that we, it's something that we can bring to Cadott that would help increase our game day atmosphere like it is at all these other schools. So that being said, I just wanted to reach out. I mean, at that point, I still hadn't seen a football game day here in my role as athletic director. I also don't know what football game days look like at other schools. So it was just important to get information from schools that I thought were relevant to us in that we play in that conference. And then the feedback is what is in front of you that was shared. If a school in fact did have a rubberized track, they did not allow fans on it. And a lot of the schools that were pointed out that, we should do what they are doing with having fans close to the field, they in fact do not have a rubberized track or have no track altogether. So, that being said, we, in addition to the preservation of the track, we just have other concerns with it, with just the safety and liability of bringing people onto the track for proximity to the game, also possible distractions just with fans interacting with players or parents interacting with players and coaches while the game is going on. So that being said, we just, while I think that they brought up some good points about, that other schools are doing it, we just are not a direct comparison to anybody that they say that is currently operating with that game day setup right now. A lot of the ADs that I did speak to that don't currently have a track or have blacktop tracks said if we were to eventually install one, we probably would not allow fans on it as well. So beyond the schools that were presented in front of you, I've also talked to numerous ADs at college level or at other schools, and just their conversation with me is similar to all these other schools as well. So, as Jenny mentioned, in their initial meeting to us, it was a long list of things that they thought that we could introduce that would improve our game day experience. We did make a lot of those changes, or made some small incremental improvements that I think that would go a long way within that. I think we also have opportunity as well outside of those things that they listed, and outside of inviting people on the track where we can increase, make the game day experience better for fans, spectators, and the team as well. So that is where we are right now, is that we've had back and forth a lot over the last month, and at this point, we still are, I personally am not in a position to move forward with allowing people onto the track, but I'm open for conversation. I want to know people's feedback, their experience with it. If you do know of a school that does let people on their rubber track, I would like to speak with them. A lot of my outreach to these schools was, I want to learn from you. What can we do if we do allow it? How can we project our track? What obstacles do you face? So that's
Did they say anything if it would be visiting fans too, or just?
They said it would be Cadott fans only.
Are they, where do they wanna stand, over by the press box?
So initially, the conversation was they wanted them just as it was prior to 2013, where they could walk the entire track, basically follow the ball during the game. And then after initially getting back to them, they then went back and said, you know what, maybe we don't need to walk the entire track. If you have concerns with interaction with players and fans, maybe we only go to the 20-yard line. So there's still like a 5-yard buffer between the team and the fans. So fans would just pretty much stand between the end zone and the 20-yard line. But then again, also by doing that, you're limiting the space where this group of people can go, so there is more foot traffic in one concentrated area, which then has preservation concerns.
This is kind of like when I went to school. It's almost like the gym floor. You weren't allowed to have street shoes on the gym floor. And I feel kind of the same way about this. I'd hate to have a track person out there after somebody with funky shoes had done something to that track. Because I have the feeling, I understand the football supporters, but how many of them have kids who are in track?
And we also looked at like track preservation as a whole, and typically your track teams run on lanes 1 and 2. That's where the bulk of their work is. So if people are allowed to go on that track, where do you suppose they would stand? Lanes 1 and 2. So your longevity of that track is just going to go down, and that expense to resurface that X number of years is going to be, sooner probably. Now we only are talking about 4 nights, so there's that piece too. But to your point, the shoes that are allowed on tracks with your warranty technically should only be, straight like tennis shoes, and like 1/8 of an inch track spikes. Now Missy's got some pretty nice high heels on. She pokes a hole through that with an accident because they're soft. There's a compression rating to tracks for a reason. So their shins and knees are taken care of. So if you do poke a hole in it, you're gonna have to patch that, and now you're gonna have to patch that with an expense to patch it. So that was an additional conversation, and you would likely need to put up a fence around the football field then, so that we have a fence on the outside for a reason, but now we're gonna allow people to do inside that fence, so we put another fence to keep them from going onto the field. I don't think Brad is going to go onto that field. We trust our people, but if we open that up and Aaron's not around, some kid could take off in there, So right now, we have people standing by that main gate to kind of at least monitor that flow of people going in. So that was why that in addition to what Aaron said, why we kind of took the stance we did.
And it's not just the foot traffic, it's also what they would bring in, their cheese curds or soda, coffee, gum, all of that. There's probably a process we would have to go through after football game days in order to clean that track, whether we have a specialized, I'm not sure any water pressure thing would work to clean it. Maybe it needs to be something special. These are just, and then also just security on game days. Who's monitoring that, making sure that individuals that go in there aren't bringing food and drink, or that they are wearing the proper attire on their feet. This group did say that they would staff that, but unfortunately, at the end of the day, even if they were to staff it and something were to happen, it comes back on us. It's going to be something that we need to address as a district. So I wouldn't feel comfortable with wanting them to staff it. We would need to staff it on our end to police that area and make sure that those things are followed, and proper protocol is also just to make sure that they don't walk into the track with those things. Now, in addition to that, though, they did point out that this track is open 24/7, and anybody is able to go there at any time, with the exception of football game days, when our team is out on the field preparing for their game, playing their game. What I would just like to point out is if an individual is going to that track on their own accord, they're most likely going there to do athletic related things. They're probably wearing the correct attire on their feet, and they're not necessarily just coming from work that day and wearing whatever boots that they're wearing, or wearing boots for the snow. It's going to be, we're inviting people to come onto that surface that are probably wearing something they wouldn't typically be wearing if they were going there to run or walk along the track.
we done any maintenance at all on that track, added rubber? Does anybody know about that at all?
I
Or-
don't believe so.
I don't think we have, you know.
And that's, I
Typically,
mean-
you resurface them in 7 to 10 years.
So, yeah.
I imagine it's coming to the point where more resurface.
It's really expensive to put new rubber on and to reline it. Pretty expensive track.
So in my head, I'm trying to separate two issues, it sounds like. There's the rubberized track and potential damage to it, and then there's the security concerns around just people being down there. Sounds like prior to 2013, we had people down there, I understand it was blacktop at that point. Were there issues at that time that we had with people being on the track?
I would say the difference, I don't know that we would have had that, it just wouldn't be a fence. The fence would be up to the sideline, so you wouldn't, it'd be just like what we have now without a fence. So people would just either send the bleachers or just walk the fence. So probably not, probably was a standard game day.
Okay, because I'm just trying to understand, like,
Yeah.
you guys brought up things like, we'd have to put a fence there and do this and that and the other thing, and it sounds like we did have a problem when there was people there, right? And even we have pretty much the same scenario now outside of the rubberized track, right? Like, nothing's really changed beyond that. So it really comes down to just the rubberized track.
I think though, it did take, when they redid the field, they took those bleachers for the opponent away from the south side, so those aren't there. And
Right.
there really isn't an area over there
Correct.
to stand, right? Or something is different over there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could restrict everybody to one side of the track then. I mean, I understand what they're trying to do. I really respect that they're trying to bring more people in and try to get more engaged. I understand your concerns. I don't know if there's something where we can, offer them a trial basis where maybe, 10 random people get chosen, so there's, maybe like a lottery and 10 people can be on there to restrict the amount of people. I don't know if that's an issue or not, but if we're really concerned about that track, we want to get more engagement, I mean, I guess I'd really like to try to work with them. I mean, they're a great group of people. They're really engaged. And for whatever reason, this one is, they're pretty hot about this one. I definitely fielded a few phone calls, and, so I don't know if there's still something we can try to find an in-between on it.
Yeah,
I don't have a stake either way in it, I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way we can try to make some happiness out of it.
Feel a little bit the same way, but having track kids, I think I get bothered by, I think about that aspect too, but I also go back to, we got 4 games. I'd like to think we could trust our community. I want to eliminate everything else, like you said, like we're just dealing with the rubberized track. I don't want to see that go ahead. And if we gotta replace it sooner than we're supposed to, yeah, that's gonna be some community outcry there. We don't have football fans on there, we wouldn't have to do this right now. But, yeah, I like the idea of it too. I would like to see if there's something we can work out. We give them 2 games this year and see how it goes. I don't know.
Previously, when we built that track too, one of the issues was seating. Everybody was standing on the sidelines and, we couldn't see, that. And so we built those bleachers, the high bleachers, handicap bleachers, so we could see over. And that was one of the reasons why we did that. Just to resolve that problem because of the new track.
Right.
How do the coaches feel about this? Do they want this?
I got something from Jeff saying that he is not opposed to it. He didn't really say that he wanted it, but he said I would have all heard that he was against it, that would be incorrect.
Does the liability fall if a little kid runs out on the field and gets tackled by a big kid? Where does the liability fall in place?
I mean, it's ours to
I
supervise.
think that's pretty good piece of what we're talking about.
And I think, even with the wear and tear on the rubberized track, there's not really a formula to say, that will take 7.1 years off or months off, or, you just don't really know until you try it. Obviously, there'll be an impact of some sort, because you got more traffic than you do now. So there'll be some impact, it's just, again, it's sort of balancing the community wanting to do that, and it's sort of being the community's track with the, responsibility for trying to keep the longevity as long as we can. And I mean, I'll say that's why we kind of erred on that conservative point the first time. Plus, because there were multiple requests, most of them were granted, and the only other one that I didn't mention yet, although my impression is the track is probably their strongest wish, is the fans in the end zone and having the band in the end zone. I know when we talked to Nick Peters, he prefers not to be in the end zone, to be in kind of that west bleacher where he has been, so we sort of have gone with his preference on that, but.
I wonder, what is their, are they looking for like the student body to be on the track? Are they looking for family members to be on the track? I mean, is there a certain, who are they looking to?
I
have
think it
on
could
there?
be anyone.
I think it's for more of an engagement thing, right? You're sitting on the field and it's like football time. I remember when I was on the football team, and we were fans back in the day, like you're sitting on the field next to somebody, Brent Crank lights somebody up and everybody's just as jacked up, like you're 20 feet away or 30 feet away.
Yeah.
What do you, I mean, it's
Yeah.
not as impactful, right? So it's the whole community engagement, like, that's why I like the group too, because they're getting people involved, and that's what we wanna see, like, we wanna see people be involved all around. I get the longevity part of the track, and this is where, like, if we put rules in place and they get broke, then it's like you take away the treat you gave them, right? But if we put rules in place, because anybody can use the track anytime, so like, any time of the day, any day of the week, and we're not monitoring this at all. But if we do monitor this, we're getting more engagement, people are wearing the right shoes, they're not putting, let's just say, food and drink on there. And we can go even to the next step. I mean, we can go buy a $2,000 track, or for $4,000, we can take a tarp and tarp that whole one side of the track. We could go to that level, we could try the first step, right? But
So
ultimately, like, if we put rules in place and we allow it, it's just engaging and it's more like it's a front line football game.
Yeah, I like that thought. It's just, you could add so many rules and it could turn into such a big beast to be,
They could, but if we say you have to wear tennis shoes and there's no food or drink on it, it's just like going into any gym. Like, you don't let food or drink in the gym and you wear your tennis shoes. I mean,
There is somebody by that gate already, right?
excuse me?
We have someone man that gate already, right?
Not really. There is a table set up there that has, football support, like they can sell
Yeah,
t-shirts.
memorabilia.
So that is really the only thing, that's not a staff member or a game day worker.
Typically our staff stands there, just that we're like teaching staff were, I'll stand by there.
Yeah,
Steve was standing by there last game.
But it's not for a purpose, it's just for,
I know we've been hearing a lot from the football people too, but I'd sure like to hear from the track and field coaches too, and the track and field community about how they feel about fans being on that track.
I mean, we can protect it, or
Hey, well.
we could regulate it with tennis shoes, so they shouldn't really hurt
But
it.
that's not,
we
you know
could
that's
get
not
it
gonna
mad.
happen.
If I wanted to watch, I watched football game last Friday night, and I was stuck on the 20-yard line, and most of the game was on the other 20-yard line, and I remember going up and down, but you're stuck in one spot, you really got to see the game.
so I think this probably does need to come to the meeting, is what it sounds like, because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot, there can be some more discussion about it, you know, do we limit it to just, no matter how many games are actually scheduled at home, so you get 2 a year, make those your big nights, make them your theme nights, whatever it is, and those are the ones you plan for, and, you know, this is the fun night, the crowd gets to be on the field, here are the rules and expectations, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we can tackle it with rules, regulations, but we could tackle it with, you raise enough money, we can tarp the whole track. I mean, $4,000, we can get 300 feet of tarp and tarp the whole thing, and you can have all the fun you want on Friday night at football.
I'd like to hear from our buildings and grounds person too, and see what he has to say about it.
But I mean, what do we do now currently, anybody else who goes out there, we don't monitor anything, so if we're monitoring the football game.
It should help. I'm trying to stay partial here because like Aaron had said, yeah, it's open to the public anytime, but the group of people that is out there, I go out there and I'm not wearing heels. I'm out there wearing tennis shoes. And the people that choose to go out there
There's,
using the property.
there's always a lot of people who are gonna be good at music, okay, and somebody who doesn't use it the right way, if it's not locked up, right? So it's
Right.
open right now, so.
One thing I wanted to bring up too, just to, when this does go to the next level, just keep in mind the competitive equity nature of football games. In fact, if we, I know they wanted it to be just Cadet fans, so So if you are gonna allow people on that track, like if it's a WIA playoff game, you have to have equal seating for everybody, and you have to like split your bleachers in half and provide extra seating spaces. So like at a playoff level, for sure, you wouldn't probably be able to allow that. But if we were gonna do it like to be kind of, I guess, if we go to Fall Creek, our fans can walk all over. But then if they came to us and we only allowed our fans, that might look bad to our neighboring districts that we try to, Aaron has to meet with them every month. So they might get upset if we don't, I mean, if you're gonna do that, just consider that it might be a cordial thing to do to allow just anyone to do that. And they can go on the sidelines by their fans, which is what they probably would do. I don't think you'd have a bunch of intermingling, but.
So when this was brought up, they also spoke specifically, like Jenny said, about the end zone. And when we did get back to them, that is where we were like, hey, let's try this out for a game this year, see how that goes. Initially, I had said something like homecoming might be a good opportunity, but they were like, you know what? We were doing the youth night is a theme night for the September 17th game, so could we do something for that game? And the answer was yes. We were like, yeah, we can definitely do it for that one. Let's see how it goes. We're inviting people into the fence area. Let's see how, just with this staffing and security and putting up the little ropes to keep them in that area, how that looks, and is it successful? Like, it's important if we're gonna have people have that open and have actually put stands. There's a grass area in the one end zone that's closest to the high school side. Is it successful? Do we have fans that are actually going in there to watch the game? Their thought process was, it's a youth night, let's invite the youth programs to sit in that area for that particular game with like coaches and such supervising the kids at all levels. So I do think we want to work with them. We want this to be, like I said, we want a great game day environment. We can't control what happens on the field, but we can control there are other things that we can control, and this is something, the flow of traffic and the fan experience, but that stems through a lot of things. There's a lot of ways that we can engage the community. And Jenny has mentioned that we've taken a conservative approach to not letting people on the track. What I would just say, we are following what every other school in Wisconsin that I have been able to be in contact with is doing. If they have a rubber track, they're protecting it, they're protecting their investment, and they're not allowing people on it. If they don't have that set up, and they have the setup we had prior to 2013 when we installed this, they are just allowing fans to move around as they need to. They do have to have, there's a rope around the field if that is the case, that is required just for the safety of the game. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind. But I do agree that it needs to move forward. I just hope that the individuals that come to support or speak to this represent our community and not just the one group of people that know this is actually on the board agenda.
Jenny, can you make sure that we reach out to the other directors, coaches,
Yep.
make sure everybody's here in attendance then?
Well, we could just say when the track is finally spent, right before we redo it, 5 years down the road, go ahead, football team.
Yeah.
You can have a year.
So we talked about this again next meeting, or?
Yes, I would agenda, so,
It would be an action item.
and then it would be an action item, because then I think whatever rules and parameters are, we wanna make sure everybody's on the same page with that.
And you guys are gonna bring some type of recommendation to, how you feel we should proceed as later on.
Correct, I mean, correct.
Are we gonna list that as inviting the people to talk about that one, or how do we do that? Cause I know like there's always issues about having the community engage when we're in
I
open
mean,
session.
so what I would say is, I mean, specifically, like to Cedric's question about other coaches that use the track, I mean, those are people specifically that I'm guessing we would want to hear from.
Or if we could give that information.
Right, I mean, sometimes people are or are not comfortable coming to the actual meeting, but, and I'm guessing that the group that is supporting this will come and speak in public comment. I mean, guess the short answer to the question is, like, we can reach out and say it's on the agenda for action, just so that they know it's on there.
Thank you.
Anything else on that? Employee handbook updates, and if you looked kind of on the right, similar to the grading manual, anything that changed, this is a lengthy document, so I'll just highlight kind of the big things. For example, some of them are just logistical, like now Erin Hawkins is the lead custodian at the elementary, contact information, the organizational chart, you know, the new school calendar. The page kind of 48, the grievance procedure is kind of completely replaced. If you remember, we redid the Neola policy. So I just cut and pasted and put that in there. The other piece in the old grievance policy, so grievances happen for two reasons. One is for discipline and the other is workplace safety, but the policy is really the same no matter what your reason is. So that's why we just eliminated that workplace safety and had it cover both, because the process is exactly the same. And then the other pieces are kind of on page 72, like the compensation plans that we changed. Some of that was old language that had to do with the old teacher plan that was deleted. And then I just put in the new chart for the teacher compensation as well as the support staff. It's right there. Page 95 is the support staff compensation. So those are the big changes. Like I said, there are logistical changes around contact people, some things like that. But this also would come up in September for approval, but I would want, if there was feedback that was needed or something else between now and then, so that we had a chance to do that.
So Jenny, who reviews that? Is that you or all the administrators, or who does?
I mean, it depends. So typically, I do, unless, if it's something connected, so for an example is the year before, we did a change of unpaid leave, where we had a lot of people taking unpaid leave, couldn't get coverage, so we changed the language around, that we could require you to be able to have coverage before you got leave granted. That was something that we kind of talked about together, so it sort of depends, or sometimes, if it's a payroll thing, or like with Sue, like when do you have to have your credits in to move on the language, then, well, depending on what the topic is.
Okay, that's the information report.
Yes,
Yeah.
but like the Neola policy I did, once we upgraded that policy, I knew we had to change it, because you want your language to align. And we don't wanna look like we have two different processes.
Jenny, I'm on my tab, so maybe I don't see it. Does this have the changes highlighted, like with
It'll say,
draft mode?
yeah, so like there's a little,
Oh, okay, I didn't see it.
like a thing on the right-hand
Okay,
side.
Okay, alright.
Okay.
So I just don't see it on my tablet, okay.
Yes. And like I said, I mean, it'll look like I crossed out a whole big section of grievance, but it's
Right.
because
Right,
that was workplace safety, I just said it applied the same.
okay.
Any other thoughts on that? Coach's handbook, this does not have changes, other than, updated dates and that type of thing. That one I did slate for action just so that it could be completed. And like I said, going forward, I probably will be fussier about action items, but
So other than the title, nothing's changed.
correct.
I'd make a motion to approve the coach's handbook as presented.
Second.
Rebecca, second by Chrissy. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Library plan, and this is another one that we talked about, I mean, because it kind of was slated for action, we wanted to come back with more information. So I listed it as an action item, although a lot of it is providing, just some more specific information that the board had asked for around what did the old plan look like. Kind of a list of the books that had been ordered kind of in the last big order. I mean, I will say it's, a lot of the questions I think are around the American Library Association requirements and just, again, part of it is from a workload standpoint, at what point is there, I don't know, that censorship isn't quite the word I'm looking for, but, vetting of selections. But the other is, we are required in the law, the language there is that it has to be reflective of your pluralistic society. We have, different non-discrimination and other requirements that we have to meet. And I would just say, I would honestly encourage people, if you have books that you're concerned about, to go through that process of reconsideration. I've been in other districts where it's happened, and it's usually helpful, because then you get a variety of opinions and perspectives on something, and then you can kind of come to a decision.
So after the last meeting, I had several people ask me what book I was referring to when I was talking about the book that I had issue with. So I just wanted to kind of highlight the issue. I think the people that I talked to when I read some excerpts out of the book, I think they thought, oh, okay, there's some books in the library that maybe are maybe more adultish than I expected. But when I read the content of the book, they're like, wait, it says what? And they were definitely not prepared for what was in there. So I'm kind of going to do what they do on TV, and that's, if you're watching this video at home, you have children, maybe you want them to leave the room, because I'm going to read you a little bit out of this. So the book I'm going to read is Dear Martin. The premise is that there's a young boy in high school, and he's writing a letter to Martin Luther King, and it's about racial equality. So on the surface, it's a New York Times bestseller. I think on the surface one would think, okay, this is a good book for the library, right? So let me just read. I'm just going to read a small little piece here. So this is chapter 4, page 31. It's listed out kind of like a play, so the names are first. Jared, if you ask me, she just wants Justice to pop her little cherry. Kyle, well, seeing as you never did it. Jared, shut up. We were in 8th grade. Blake, you still want to tap that, bro? Kyle, too late, though. If Justice is your competition, you're screwed, dog. Once you go black, right, Manny? So that's just a piece of it. I was definitely taken aback when I heard that. That's sitting on a shelf right over there that anybody in this library can check out. That opened my eyes, I think, to what content is in the library. I don't know how the rest of you feel. If this was a book that, like Grapes of Wrath, where it was a required reading in English, and everybody had to read a chapter a week, come and discuss it, there's some guidance there, right? If any young boy in our school said any of those phrases to another girl, they'd probably be facing detention or expulsion, right? There's no guidance here. And that's my primary issue with the book, is that there's just no guidance. If you as a parent want your kid to read this book, you can go buy that book and check that book out, and they can have guidance. I think that's okay. But I think for it just to be on the shelf here, things of that nature in this district, I don't think they belong here without guidance. That's my opinion. So I'm more bringing this up to kind of give some transparency to both the board and the community what actually is in the library. Now, certainly this might be one of the, on one end of the spectrum, right? I'm not suggesting all our books are like that. But the fact that this book at that level was here was a little shocking. Right? So I think that's one issue we have to figure out. I don't know how we correct at this point, or maybe the community doesn't want us to correct. I don't know. I guess we'll probably hear after this meeting.
Well, is that, and I don't, like, is that a book that you would raise for reconsideration? I mean, to me, that seems to fit the exact example, at least, that we're talking about.
Right. And again,
because I feel like it might be helpful to go through that process with a book.
Right. And I think more than anything too, I mean, that, you know, there was certainly some phrases in there that I just read that I think are pretty significant. But even more than that, you've got half the book, which is the letter to Martin Luther King, which is great, and the other half is you've got young boys very much objectifying women, which is what we are trying to teach our kids not to do. And so I really struggle with how we have a book like that that's showing behavior that we do not endorse and that we don't want in our school. And that's difficult for me to understand. So, and again, it's more the issue that I don't realize it's here, and I didn't realize I even had to be aware that my son or daughter could come check this book out. I think that's my issue. I know I did request in an email on August 10th, basically it was, you know, once we had the first meeting, I had sent to you, Jenny, and the board saying, you know, just kind of like some information on, you know, what currently was out there for the recent purchases, right? You know, why this book was selected, you know, student teacher requested recommended by the library associations, what library the book is going to, high school, elementary, what age is the book targeted at, and the synopsis of the book. And your response was, you know, I think that's great. I'll connect with Nick. We all know that Nick is overworked already, and he's got a lot on his plate. But your response was that might be hard to get. And so immediately like, okay, well, if that's hard to get, then how are we supposed to be doing the selection process, right? That's already part of the problem. You did give me a lot of information. It was 2 zip files containing, for the elementary, 22 files, and for the high school, another 19 files. And that was really good information, but when you unpack all those and read through them, I spent 4 hours one day and I maybe got through 5% of what you sent me. So again, I'm just looking at, that's for the last, that's 2020 and 2021. And so I'm one person, 4 hours, I'm barely a few percent into it. It's not feasible at this point to say that the board can be responsible for what's in this library, the way that this is written, or even delegate somebody to be, right? Like, we don't have the resources.
Well, I think especially as you, like, the list of what's purchased is one thing, but, for example, a synopsis, especially if someone has to do a synopsis, and I mean, we've talked about even from the librarian, I mean, a lot of what they look at are what are award-winning books, what are, you know,
Right.
those kinds of things. I mean, the other issue that is, I mean, realistic, and I did look at some of our neighboring districts, I mean, I would say they have the same, you know, many of us have the same books, is just logistically, we are a district that has a 712 library. When I worked in Chippewa Falls, they had a separate, like, if your middle school library is separate, there's different books. I mean, part of it is you have to have some availability for some students. I mean, I think I guess I'm not sure if that's your question, is the board gonna wanna be vetting books on the front end? You know, currently, and it is actually, I mean, even by law, like the library media specialist, just by licensure, is the person that kind of makes that initial determination, and that's the whole point of the reconsideration policy is, you know, maybe that person isn't gonna be able to read every book.
Right. I guess what I'm bringing up too is, when you look at the new policy in the responsibility selection, the very first sentence says, the legal responsibility for developing the library collection ultimately rests with the board. Okay, so that's us. We're responsible. There's no way I can pass this because I can't be held responsible right now under the current process, right? Like, there's just no way. And so I'm servicing it to say that something would have to change significantly in process for the board to say, yeah, I'm responsible for that, right?
So is it, and I don't mean this to sound flip, because I don't, but is it changing the language in the policy around the responsibility around, I get it's still like everything, yes, falls under the purview of the board, but
Right.
being more the library media specialist language instead of the board, I mean,
I think it
I'm
brings
just
up-
throwing that out there because I think, again, we want it to accurately represent
Right,
what's happening
right.
too.
I mean, I don't have a problem with it stating the board, right? My issue is the fact that we're stating something that's not reality, right? And that's the issue. So to support this, I would need to see some process in play that realistically, the board can go, yeah, we're doing everything we can to, you know, do this properly. Right now, the board has literally zero involvement, to my knowledge. And so changing the policy, well, the board's responsible, we currently have no involvement and there's no process change, and from what I just saw, what you could get me, and again, I appreciate what you got me, but obviously that wouldn't either be feasible, like the board still couldn't feasibly get through that.
Correct.
And
Well,
so-
like I said, even, like for Nick, to be able to,
Right.
like, there,
Well, and
And
you know,
even adding a position is, like, I guess, I don't know that realistically that person's gonna be able to read and do a synopsis of every book either.
Right,
And,
right.
you know, I guess, so I'm not sure the best resolution to that.
Can I just ask for clarification? Isn't it true, I think Nick explained this at the last meeting, that all those books that were brought for recommendation of purchase have already been vetted by a national library or school?
Correct.
guarantee this was vetted. In fact, if you read the synopsis, this would have passed the synopsis test too,
Yeah.
right? But when you read it, you're like, whoa, what am I reading? I think that's the issue, right? So I think there's gonna be some books ultimately that pass all those tests and will simply get reported by the parents of the kids, go, hey, I don't know if this book, is appropriate.
And that's why we have this process. And I don't think, when I read this policy, this isn't saying that the board members are responsible for each book here. We're responsible for our library specialist, who is following the proper process of having which books are in this building.
Well, and if something is brought for reconsideration, then it needs to actually go to reconsideration
Yes,
in
right.
a fair way.
Yeah,
That's why I
and
read it as well, but that doesn't mean that we are saying we've read all these books and we think they're all
I understand that, but what I'm telling you is, based on that process, it's clearly broken if these types of books are getting into the library.
So
Right.
that's a big thing to, I think that's beyond us.
Right, I think that goes to whatever board of approval is reading national level books that are getting into
But
every.
this is our library.
This is our school.
This is our library.
I
That's the
agree with you,
problem.
I'm not saying I approve that book, I'm just saying, I think that goes beyond our board.
And
I
that's
don't know
why
how
we
you-
are having this policy to file the reports and to say, this is not what our community wants in our library.
This shouldn't even get through the door, in my opinion. If your children can't repeat half the words that are in that book, or they get in serious trouble, that shouldn't even
I don't disagree with that at all, but that's not on us. I
Well,
mean,
it
that's-
is on us, because ultimately, we're the ones who are allowing it to come in here, so how do we never allow that
We
to
as
come in
board
here
members
again?
aren't reading each and every book, which is what we're saying. We are having to trust the process, which
Yep.
it sounds like we disagree. But that's why we do have to put it into parents' hands, community hands, our hands, if we hear something, to follow this policy, to pull the books out that we don't want in our buildings.
So to kind of follow on that policy trend a little bit, out of the books that I did look at on the list that they get through, I'm going to bring a very controversial subject now, which is critical race theory. Okay, and not to pick on that a little bit, but there is a book that's on the current selection list, which is How to Be a Better White Person. Okay, so I haven't read the book, but the title alone certainly feels critical race theory. Okay, and so again, if you want to bring books in How to Be a Better Person, I'm completely okay with that. But when you start throwing in the racial titles, then I start having issues again. And so again, I'm sure that passed the current process, right? And so I think if you were to take time and start looking through this, it's not like there's a book that we may not agree with as our community. I think you're going to find a lot of books we disagree with. Because we are a different community here. We don't live in Chicago, we don't live in LA, right? Where they have completely different, philosophies and values. We live out here in the rural area for a reason. I lived in Chicago for 10 years. I moved back to have this local culture and these local values. And right now, our policy doesn't support those. And trusting a national policy clearly doesn't support those.
So, again, I think we're back to, rather than just talking about it, how do we correct it? And what does this look like? And if
Right.
we can't find it, if we can't find the answer here, where do we need to go to find it? So what type of research should we be doing and how are we gonna correct it if this is what we're.
And those are the questions that we need to ask, right? And that's why I'm bringing this up. Tonight isn't about having a solution for me. Tonight is really about showing some transparency.
So, but I just wanna be careful with that, because to me, it is about finding a solution. Because I'm not going to, we cannot nitpick each book, it's about what is gonna be the better policy for our board, for our district. That's what we need to work on, not about specific books or what, we need to come up with a solution.
Right. And I want to be clear, there was a lot of books on there I found fantastic, and a lot of books I found on there had, differing religious views. Like, there is a really good representation of books in there. But there's also other books that jump right up and go, wait a minute, just on the title, you can already see there's something probably not right about it, or maybe doesn't quite conform to our values, and then you start reading, okay, yeah, this one I think should go underneath maybe a little more scrutiny. So I'm not saying you have to read every single book, And again, this book probably would have made it right through that critical selection process. But I also think that, I spent 4 hours and I had a list of 10 books that I thought probably required some additional research, right? And so I agree, we don't have to go through every book. But I think right now, I don't think we do anything past just what those recommendations are. And I don't think that's enough.
So are you saying you want the board to pick out books?
I'm saying the board needs to put a process in play that is a little bit more robust than what we have today.
Well, that's what, that library plan, it was like being familiar with what I had to do. That's not much different than what Mrs. Post did, what Mrs. Mayberry did, Mrs. Laurent. That's all the same, that's all what we had to follow. Yes, that book might not meet your standard, but that doesn't mean there isn't another parent in Canada who would want their child to read that book. No.
Which is fine, but I don't think it belongs in the public library here.
That doesn't follow our core values of the whole
But
entire
You can't
district.
repeat these statements in school.
You couldn't even read that.
But there's
book
a
in
difference
school.
because there's gonna be kids that appreciate literature in a different way, that know that they're reading isn't how they're supposed to behave.
And there's gonna be kids that don't know the difference that get
Absolutely,
this book.
but we talk about parents having to have credibility when we talk about, look at Skyward, look at this, see where your kids are at.
And they
How
should
do
know
we
these are
stop
in the
that at
library.
there and not, there has to be a little bit of that.
If you're gonna hold the parent accountable, they at least have to know.
You can hold me accountable all you want. My kid might sneak that book because Billy Joe was reading it, be like, oh, look at this, ha ha ha. And then it becomes a bullying issue because this is taking place and you can hold me accountable, but I might not know what's going on in these four walls.
Right, I hear that.
My son can't even wear a Trump flag and I'm getting called. But you can read this book and expect kids to hopefully not repeat these words? I don't know.
I think it's kind of two-pronged. A little bit is, so what I've heard that I think we need to do is use the reconsideration process, because that we haven't done. And that, kind of on purpose, brings together people with sort of different backgrounds and values to agree, whatever that agreement is. I don't wanna even pre-guess it, because I've been involved in it on both ends, around that specific title. And then I think, because again, that's what that's for. But then the other is there, I'll just say, additional steps in the process. I don't know that that's even quite how I mean it initially. So it's kind of two things. I will say, there are books that are read that contain the N-word, contain words that we don't allow kids to say. And that's, again, part of that has to do with the grade level and the maturity where we talk about that. But, that has, we think of Catcher in the Rye or some of those others. Not that we even necessarily are doing that, but that's happened throughout many years. So I think that in it, I don't know that in itself is the rule, but I do think for that text, we use that reconsideration policy, go through all of, is there value there, is there not, and where we end up, but then is there any additional step around the selection process on the front end?
So can we reach out to other districts and see if they have a further selection policy, and what they do, what that looks like?
I've looked just locally, and I will say, and Nick can
And
talk about other
I've looked at other district
They
ones too.
all
Their
are.
policies, that policy that you guys have in front of you is literally a pretty standard policy for a school library.
And not that I wanna compare every other district to solely that, because we are talking about what is best for our district. But there has to be there's gotta be something more we could follow that. I don't know what that looks like, but we have to start looking for something rather than just talking. If this is something we actually wanna do, we're gonna have to do some legwork and find out what that looks like.
One thing I did find when I was going through it, and Nick, you probably know more than I do on this, I found specific genres had more controversial books than other ones, right?
They can.
Yeah, and so it might even be simply identifying some of the genres that come in. Because I know when I was looking through the list, consistently one or two genres kept jumping out as this is one more book I think the community would want to review. So that might be a step. I don't have the perfect answer. I just think that we need to do more than we're doing today. I understand that we have a really comprehensive library policy now, and that it's kind of out there. But again, we're not the only school dealing with this right now. I've seen plenty of YouTube videos where this exact book and issues like this are being raised all throughout the nation, right? So I think this is a little bit of an awareness issue as well that's happening. That's why we're seeing it here as well. So I don't think we're the only school that's actually facing this issue right now.
So
I would like to find those, and I believe you completely, I would like to find those schools and find out what they're doing, so we can have some place to start.
Bloomer would be one of them. I know.
Bloomer?
Yeah, the police chief stood up and read over this book. So I believe that was one, right, Kevin?
My thought on the building leadership team is that we have a group of 15 of our leaders in each school district, or each building. So as these books come in and recommended, somehow that gets vetted through the monthly meetings, right? So we could add, that's just an example.
And
We
the
don't
only
have to
caution
have
I'll
them
give you
all.
is going back to our priorities, like
Yep.
whatever we switch and spend more time on, we're not spending time on something else. And not that I don't think that's valuable, but I just wanna
Well,
add
so
that as a
ultimately,
precaution, we're gonna
if he
train
doesn't-
somewhere.
If he doesn't have enough time to do it, right, if one person doesn't, and we wanna expand, then where else can we help out at this, right? So if there's 15 people doing once a month meetings, and there's 10 books that come in, there's no way that those 15 people can quick talk about these books and say, yep, these are out there.
Well, they won't, I mean, they have a.
No, I wouldn't say they're gonna read them, but you can,
So then how
you can look at the summary of that book and you have. a
But so
really
then
good
that ends up
example.
being the exact same thing that I do.
That's right.
And I do that for every single one of those books, and I look at those recommendations, and I go through those journals and everything. And I run all this stuff by DPI, I run it by CCBC. Everything that we are doing is exactly what I should be doing.
As a parent
and-
and a teacher and a person on BLT, what are the genres that are your flag genres? I'd like to know, like you had said.
I literally don't remember what they were. I didn't even recognize the genre names, to be honest.
Okay.
When I was going through, I could look again and find out.
I would be curious as to kind of what genres you were thinking of, like, was it like Black Lives Matter stuff?
No, I mean, there's
Was
no
it-
genre for that. I mean, I want to be clear, there's no genre for that. I want to say it was something like reality or real life or something along that line. I don't remember what it was.
Realistic
Realistic
fiction.
Realistic
Yeah.
fiction.
Yeah, that's the one I think that most one jumped off.
The other
No,
thing.
I know.
The other
I
thing to
guess-
keep in, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I mean, just the other thing we want to keep in mind, you know, like with talking with Monica Trupto at DPI, she's the head school library person and consultant there, and talking with CCBC, we have to remember that as these books are coming in, we have to use that reconsideration policy. Like legally, we have to. As far as like books coming in, you can have all the people look at them that you want, but I'm the licensed library media specialist. I'm the one that the state designates to be able to spend the common school fund, and I have to sign off on that stuff. So I'm already doing that job as it is, so I don't know why we would have 15 other people looking at it
But the
as
board
well.
is responsible for everything in the district, and then we have this
Board
book.
is responsible for our employees,
Right.
not these books.
But we're responsible for everything in these four walls, ultimately.
But then that's why we have that reconsideration policy
This
too.
book shouldn't even come in the building.
But again,
This might be the
but
only
again,
one, but some of the language that he just read was, I'm not sure that, what.
Brad, I wouldn't disagree with that either. It is, offensive language. But we, as a district, have to use that reconsideration policy. We have to look at that book as a whole. That is one, short, 6, 7, 8 line passage in that entire book, and that's the only time anything like that comes up in it. So we responsibly and ethically have to really review the book as a whole, not just based on those few lines on that one page.
So I'm not sure.
There's a lot of
yeah.
objectification of women in that book. That was the most strong language, but the book and the tone of the book towards women itself is inappropriate, I think, to our school standards.
I just reread it though, and I didn't think it was.
I
really
think there's
that bad.
probably several people in the room that have read the book, and that is just a small part of the book. That's why I'm curious, what are the genres that you're, as a.
So I guess I would say, whatever point this book is trying to get across, there's got to be another book that gets that same point across without that level of language. I think that's my key issue. I don't have a problem with the moral of the book, okay? I have a problem with the content on certain areas of the book that we can't find another book with the same moral, right? The same lesson that has not as offensive language.
And I think that is that whole point of that policy. I mean, I think this is, I don't know that I'll say a perfect example, but it kind of is of what that process is meant to do. And, whether it should have been caught on the front end or the back end, it's here. So now let's use that reconsideration piece for that, and then, I mean, I know Brian very well in Bloomer, I can reach out to see what is their like. Cause I just kind of generally looked at some,
You were saying it was Avery,
It
not
was
Bloomer?
Avery.
Avery, sorry.
oh, okay.
It was the Bloomer Police Chief, I believe, that was doing it or something like that, wasn't it? Or
I don't think it was Bloomer, but another
it was a
local one up there.
I forgot which one it was.
Okay.
I would just like to address what Brad said about using the BLT in order to read and vet these books. Our job is to help our district achieve our strategic plan. And our strategic plan is to raise our scorecard. That's a big part of it. If we do this, that work will not get done.
I
Because
agree.
we only have a certain amount of time.
So I wasn't trying to put extra work on you, I'm just trying to think how we catch something like that with just, I mean, one person is busy, we've already said it up front, so I wasn't trying to put more work on the building leadership team, but then there's more eyes on
Well, and I
what's
was,
coming in, right? So like,
Either that
how do we
or
catch some of that stuff?
But we have to keep our focus on what the building leadership team is about.
right, and I would even go as far as to say that if the community's not outraged by this, then maybe I'm fighting a losing battle, right? Like, I'm okay, so like after this meeting airs and people hear this and they see this, if nobody cares, okay, then we can move on.
I'm gonna say this one more time then. I don't think that what we're talking about is about that book. It is about adjusting a policy or trying to find a better screening process. I don't love that that book was read. Because I don't think that it's specific
This
about
book,
that book.
this book
We're trying to
illustrates
figure out
why
a
we need
policy.
a new policy. Right? I think, are we in agreement there? Like this, I'm not saying, I'm using this book as an example of why we need a new policy, or a different policy, or something in addition to the policy. That's what I'm asserting. I'm not asserting that this is, you know, the litmus test for every book in here. I'm just saying that this is something that hits the radar.
Alright,
I would
we can,
just-
make a motion to, or not make a motion, I guess, make a motion to table this.
Yeah, I'll make a motion to table it. And then, until we have further review on this library license.
Motion by Cedric, can you get a second?
I'll second.
Second by Chrissy. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I,
Corey and Brad.
Corey.
Oh, yeah.
Need a motion to approve some new hires?
I make that motion.
I'll second.
Second by Becca. All in favor?
I,
Any opposed? Motion carries. To approve open enrollment application.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Second by Don. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. You wanna talk about this one?
Sure, one of the things we talked about is sometimes if people either mention something in passing to me or Al, unless we are cognizant and think about it, just a chance for the whole board to talk about, are there future agenda items that we want included in an example? So generally, the committee meeting is an example of a meeting that's more of a work session or a learning session, would be if the board was ever interested in a book study, like the governance book study that was at Green Bay that we went to, or, a piece of like a mini Robert's Rules of Order. There's kind of like a Robert's Rules for Dummies, or, you know, something just to help cover the basics, even a finance piece, going through our financial report, and some of the details on that, and especially going forward as we kind of get into some of our preliminary, state aid and some of that for this school year. So those were just a couple of ideas that I had, but are there agenda items that people feel like we need to make sure, and I guess, I mean, you can talk about, there's some things from tonight that we've talked about moving forward, like the fans on the track and some of those, but are there things besides that that we need to make sure to include on future agenda items?
And I guess another way to think about this too, is any action items that come out of this meeting, right? So things that came up tonight that we talked about, if we think there needs to be a follow-up, that's also like an action item, good way to follow that, so we don't lose it enough.
And some will be, I don't necessarily follow-up, I didn't get, just, I guess to clarify for myself, I don't know that there's a lot of new information needed, like we'll be voting on the vaping lawsuit, or, we'll be, doing the employee handbook update, like those will come back. I don't necessarily plan to have new information on that based on the questions that I did or didn't get. The strategic plan, I did update some of those things that will come back to the September meeting. Coach's handbook, we approved, that's done. The library plan will come back, the track will come back. Are there other things, just to make sure that we don't miss them?
We're gonna have the grading review come back, right?
Yes, cause that'll be approved.
And then, the leadership team notes.
Yes.
And maybe like a job description slash procedure and like how, like, years of service or how they're selected, or just to make sure everybody, I would say, so everybody's kosher on how the building leadership team is selected. Right, so if you're not on the building leadership team, you're disgruntled, this is how you get on.
Part of the solution instead of the problem.
And sometimes it is
And the
just,
building leadership team is doing a great job, I'm not trying to say anything about the building
Right.
leadership team not doing a great job, I looked at a lot of the notes, especially the elementary school notes, and it's very impressive, so I told Terry, you guys are doing a great job, so thank you for everybody who's on it. It's just, there's some questions asked about building leadership teams that I don't wanna follow through on.
There's a lot of information.
okay,
Okay, need a motion to go and close.
I don't know if you go